let's go ahead and get right to it. When to float? Here's the question. You never seem to know when you should float. I presume junky draws are not equally good. That is true. Any advice would be appreciated. All right. So, what is floating to begin with? This is when you call someone's bet on the flop, usually with some sort of junky draw, with the intention of improving to the best hand or picking up the pot with a bluff some portion of the time on the turn or river, right? And in order to very profitably float, ideally you want your opponent to play straightforwardly on the turn. Because imagine someone raises, you call on the button, let's say. They bet the flop, you call with nothing. On the turn, they're always going to bet with their good hands, and they're always going to check their marginal and bad hands. If that's the case, you can very often pick up the pot with a turn bet or a turn plus a river bet, because when they check, they've indicated they don't have a good hand, right? That is the ideal spot to be floating, and this is why floating is so profitable against mostly small and medium stakes players who just play pretty straightforwardly, right? And even in the high stakes games, a lot of people only or mostly bet the turn with a very polarized range in some scenarios, which means when they check, they have a marginal made hand or junk, which is, actually good poker. But then what they do wrong is they overfold a little bit of that range on the turn, and then they overfold a little bit of their turn calling range on the river. And that's going to result in you winning the pot more than you should. Also, floating from in position is way better than floating from out of position. Because just think about how it goes, right? We just discussed how it happens whenever you're in position, right? They check, you have the opportunity to bet on the turn and the river. But let's say you check call from out of position with a marginal hand, and then you check the turn and they check behind. Well, now, if you bet the river, if they have a marginal made hand, a bluff catcher of any sort, they just have a really, really easy call because the pot's not big, you're not applying a whole lot of pressure, and, they have to face one bet. Whereas whenever you're in position, they're going to have to face two bets. And it's way harder to call two bets than one bet. Also, if you check call from out of position and you decide you're going to lead a lot, well, leading a lot on the turn is just usually not good poker to begin with. So, that could be a fine strategy if you know your opponent will play really, really weakly against leads, but you typically don't want to, there's not a whole lot of spots to lead in general on the turn, especially as you get deeper and deeper stacked. And that's just not good poker, right? So you want to be ideally playing good poker. Does it also help if your opponent has a high continuation bet percentage on the flop? Yes, because usually if people continuation bet too often, they will inevitably have too much junk on the turn, which will result in them checking and then folding, right? Essentially, you want to find a spot where they are going to be too weak. Either because, as Mark says here, they continuation bet the flop every time or too often, so their range is just naturally weak, or because their turn play indicates a relatively weak range. These are things that make floating really, really good. And to some extent, if you know your opponent's going to play super straightforwardly on the turn, and you know their flop range just can't be all that good, then you can float with all sorts of junk with the idea that they're going to play straightforwardly on the turn, assuming you know that to be true about your opponent. Additional floating rules. We're going to call these rules in quotation marks. Typically, you're going to want to float way tighter in multi-way pots because someone's more likely to have something decent, right? Also, when someone bets on the flop into multiple players, their range just has to be a little bit stronger and a little bit more polarized, right? So if the range is a little bit stronger and a little bit more polarized, that's going to make their turn range naturally stronger. Also, a lot of people realize they can't continuation bet the flop multi-way every time, or even most of the time. People have figured this out. So for that reason, you're not going to want to be doing a whole lot of floating in multi-way pots, except for with hands with pretty good equity that make logical sense. Turns out, playing multi-way pots isn't all that difficult because usually you just continue with your good hands, and that's good poker. But if you do play against someone who, let's say, raises every time and then continuation bets every ace-high or king-high flop, even if it's multi-way, because that's just how they operate, if you are last closing the action, it's still a reasonable spot to float because while they do have a lot of top pairs in their range, they also have a lot of junk. And if you call there and you know they're not going to continue barreling all that often unless they just have an ace or top pair, then maybe those opportunities exist. But in general, you want to be floating way tighter in multi-way pots. Also, you're going to want to float tighter as you face larger bets. And that's because of a few things. First, you're getting worse implied odds with your gut shot draw or whatever you have. And when people bet larger, usually they have a more polarized range, and usually more polarized ranges continue betting on the turn, which is not good for you because you want your opponent to check a lot on the turn. So the opposite of this is, or the inverse of this, whatever the right word is that you want to be floating more as you're facing smaller bets because you're getting better pot odds and implied odds. And usually as people bet smaller, they're usually betting with just their entire range, which will lead to their range on the turn being somewhat weak. Also, you're going to want to float tighter as stacks get shallower because, again, you're lacking implied odds. And also, your opponent can more easily stack off with clearly marginal hands like middle pair, right? Like imagine someone raises, you call on the button, and they have ace-jack on a queen-jack-3 board. In that scenario, you probably can float with all sorts of gut shots and whatnot when you're playing 100 big blinds deep because you can put that ace-jack in pretty bad shape on the turn in the river with a big turn in river bet on queen-jack-3 if they have ace-jack or jack-10 or whatnot, right? But if they're playing 20 big blinds deep, they're just not going to fold it, right? So that's a scenario where as you get shallower and shallower, you should usually float a little bit less because the marginal hands can more happily stack off. So we know we're not going to be doing much floating out at all from out of position. Our floats from out of position are just going to be good hands is what it amounts to, like good, reasonable draws. So from in position, what are the best hands to float? Well, they're usually going to be hands with decent equity. And I'm just going to start from the top and go all the way to the bottom, right? We're going to call flush draws floats, even though they're not really because those are like clearly decent hands. But like if you do call with a low flush draw on the flop, you're calling with like 9 high or whatever with the idea that you're going to either make a flush and win when you make a flush, or your opponent's going to check and that's going to give you a chance to bluff, right? So flush draws are hands that you're always going to want to call or raise. And from in position, you're going to find you want to call a whole lot more often compared to when you're out of position. When you're out of position with a draw that lacks showdown value, assuming the stacks are not set up such that your opponents can just rip it in on the turn. I'm sorry, rip it in if you check raise the flop, because you don't want to check raise with like 9 high flush draw and then get jammed on, right? If you're either shallow enough to where you can be the one check shoving all in, or deep enough to where you can check raise and then still call a re-raise, then you're going to want to be doing a lot of check raising with your draws out of position. But from in position, you're going to want to be doing a whole lot of calling. We discussed this thoroughly in the tournament masterclass, where we show that from in position, you just call a lot. And flush draws are really, really good hands to call with. Same thing with open-ended straight draws, very clearly obvious hands. Gut shot straight draws. Now, gut shot straight draws definitely vary in strength. You're going to find that in general, you want to float more often as your opponent's range is usually going to be a little bit weaker, right? So let's say you do have 10-9, or 9-8, 9-8 on queen-jack-3. Same queen-jack-3 board, right? If you're playing in a scenario where you have a gut shot, 9-8 on queen-jack-3. If you get a 10, you have a straight. But if a 10 comes, you could still easily be beat by ace-king, right? And also, your opponent's going to have a whole lot of queens and a whole lot of jacks in their range. That's a scenario where that gut shot straight draw is pretty bad, right? And it should probably just be folded to a bet, even though you have some equity, especially if you're facing a polarized bet. But if you have a hand like 9-8 on 6-5-2, where you get a 7, you have a straight, or a 9 or an 8, now you have top pair, that's a spot where you're way happier with your gut shot. So gut shots with overcards are usually pretty good. Gut shots with one overcard are usually pretty good, assuming if you make that gut shot, it's really unlikely your opponent has a straight. You always have to be wary of hands like ace-king, ace-queen, king-queen, etc., right? But you don't have to be so wary of hands like 9-8. So overcards with a gut shot or a gut shot with one overcard is usually pretty good. The undercards are only reasonable when your opponent's ranges should be pretty weak. Next, backdoor flush draws. Ideally, backdoor flush draws with 2 overcards is pretty good in most scenarios. Backdoor flush draws with 1 overcard is weaker. Backdoor flush draws with no overcards and no gut shot straight draw, etc. are usually pretty garbage. So keep that in mind. Again, they vary in strength. Like you would almost rather have a hand like 2 overcards than a backdoor flush draw with no overcards, right? Next, 2 overcards. Say you have queen jack on 7-6-3. That's a spot where you can call the queen jack, and if your opponent bets the turn, you can just fold unless you improve. And if they check the turn, you can bluff. And if you improve to a queen or a jack on the turn, you have top pair, and you're very happy, right? So 2 overcards can sometimes be pretty good, sometimes not. Also, backdoor straight draws. Again, these are a little bit weaker unless they have overcards included. Backdoor straight draw with no overcards is pretty terrible. Backdoor straight draw with 2 overcards is pretty reasonable. And you should usually not float with hands much weaker than these. You should not be calling with stuff like king high very often unless there's an ace on the board, right? King high is way better with an ace on the board than when there's not. You should not be floating with stuff like just random 2 undercards or one overcard and a backdoor straight draw. You should not be calling with garbage. It is worth noting, like ace high sometimes counts as marginal made hand, right? So don't think that, like I'm assuming all of these hands here have no showdown value. All of it, that's presumed here, right? All of these hands cannot win on their own merit if it checks down. That is presumed. If you have ace high, that's not really a, it's not really like a float because ace high could very often be good. But yeah, you don't want to be floating with stuff like queen high or jack high with just like stone nothing. Like say it comes ace king 3 and you have jack 8 suited, right? For a backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw. If your opponent bets, you should probably just fold the jack 8 suited because it's a pretty terrible hand and it's very easy for you to be against an ace or a king, right? So don't think you have to float with just like total garbage hands. Essentially, anything that is in the bottom of any of these categories, like gutshot straight draws, the weakest ones, are probably not very good. Weakest backdoor flush draws, not very good. Weakest two overcards, maybe this should be upgraded a little bit. Weakest backdoor straight draws, not very good. So keep that in mind. Essentially, as your hand can improve in more ways, you get to stick around a little bit wider. But when you have total junk, just fold. It's okay to fold your junk. You're supposed to fold your junk. All right, next. Let's go through some examples. Reasonable hands to float. This is when someone raises, you call in position. Doesn't really matter which position you're in, but you're going to find usually you're calling on the button or the cutoff more often than the other scenarios. Ace, 7, 6, 2 spades. Jack 10 of spades, obviously straight draw, or obviously flush draw. King 10 of hearts. King high could be good. It has a backdoor flush draw. Like, pretty decent hand. Backdoor straight draw as well. Like, this is reasonable. 9-8 open-ended, 10-8 gut shot, obviously very good. What should we not be floating? Here, Queen 4 of hearts. No backdoor flush draw. Well, a bad backdoor flush draw. Also, a weaker backdoor... what am I trying to say? Weaker backdoor straight draw to the 4, right? Weaker backdoor flush draw, which, doesn't really matter all that much. If you make a flush, you're very happy. But also, Queen high just doesn't win very often. So this is a hand that's not particularly great. Queen jack of clubs for just, Queen high, not particularly great. And King 2 of diamonds. King high could be good here, but it's easy enough for the opponent to have pretty good equity, and you're just not going to be able to continue on the turn or the river ever if your opponent keeps betting. So this is not good. Ideally, if you take a look at all these hands that are floating, there are a lot of turn and river cards where they can still continue, right? Whereas if you look at these hands that are not continuing, there's just a lot of hands that they just can't continue on turns very often at all. Like imagine you have queen jack of clubs and you turn a jack and your opponent keeps betting on ace 7 6. You don't really love it, right? All right, 7-7-2. This is the spot where now you will have very few logical draws, right? As the board gets less and less coordinated, essentially, meaning it's just like kind of hard to have anything decent, you have to get a little bit more loose with the terminology of what is a draw. So what is a draw on ace or on 7-7-2? Well, ace king is pretty good. King queen of clubs for backdoor flush draw, pretty good with two overcards. It is worth noting on 7-7-2. The overcard idea is actually not all that relevant. You'd just rather have the higher ones because they're going to make top pair more often. Because in this scenario, if the opponent has a 7, we just lose. And if they have a 2, notice like 4-3 has the same number of outs as king-queen, right? But if you turn a king or a queen, you're just never folding. Whereas if you have 4-3 and you turn a 4, you still may end up folding to a turn plus river bet. So you'd rather just have higher cards in general. 9-8 for two overcards to the 7 that also have backdoor straight draw. Again, the two overcards to the 7 is not that relevant, but overcards plus backdoor straight draw is reasonable. Same thing with 8-6. 4-3 of diamonds here would probably continue as well. 6-5 of diamonds would probably continue. Obviously, any flush draw is going to continue. King queen of diamonds would continue. So backdoor flush draws would continue there as well. I would not call with stuff like king queen of hearts, though, because, it's just slightly weaker, has a little bit less equity. 6-5, no backdoor draws, probably no good. 4-3, no backdoor draws, probably no good. Again, as your opponent bets smaller, like say they bet one big blind, you should probably continue. But if they bet 3 or 4 big blinds, you should probably fold. Okay. Then what about... Oh, one thing worth noting. Say it was instead 7-2-2. 7-2-2. Now the idea of overcards to the 7 becomes way more relevant, because on 7-2-2, now if your opponent has a 7, you'd much rather have an overcard, right? Because if you have 9-8 on 7-2-2, if you have a 9-8 and you get a 9, you win, right? Whereas on 7-7-2, if your opponent has a 7 and you get a 9, you still lose. So overcard to the pair on the board doesn't really matter. Overcard to the other card on the board, the unpaired card, is what is relevant. All right, what about queen 10, 7, all spades? Okay, relevant floats here are going to be stuff like pocket nines. Probably not good. Could be, maybe, but it has the spade. Ace 2 with the ace of spades. Pretty great hand. King Jack of hearts for open-ended. Not a great hand, but it's reasonable enough. 9-8 for open-ended. Same thing. Jack 8 of spades. This is obviously a flush. This should be like Jack of spades, 8 of clubs. This is a gut shot with Jack of spades. Pretty reasonable. What should not be floated? Pocket 2s with the 2 of spades. Pocket 2s is almost never good here. And when it is, your opponent has loads of equity. And if you get a spade, that's also likely not good if you face any aggression. The tough thing about a hand like the 2 of spades is that if you do improve to the flush and your opponent keeps betting on the turn and river, you probably lose, but they could be bluffing. And if they check, very often they're going to have a marginal spade themselves that doesn't plan on folding. So when they keep betting, you lose. And when they check, you lose, right? So it's just not quite as good of a hand. Ace of clubs, 2 of spades. You'd much rather have the ace of spades, right? Instead of the 2 of spades. Same story. If you get the 2 of spades, you're just not happy. And Jack 8 of hearts for just a gut shot. Also not a particularly great hand. Because if you make the gut shot and your opponent keeps betting, I mean, yeah, you're happy enough, but you'd just rather have the open-ended straight draws. You have enough of those. It's also worth noting, like, as you have more reasonable hands to continue, like here, you probably have a lot of hands with the ace of spades and the king of spades and the jack of spades. You, in turn, do not continue with weaker and weaker and weaker junk, right? Because you have enough hands that can reasonably continue. Whereas on a board like 7-7-2 with no flush draw, let's say, you probably need to be continuing with a lot of hands with overcards with backdoor straight draw. Whereas if there's a flush draw on board, you continue perhaps a little bit less often with those. All right, what do we do when we are facing a turn bet? Most players who bet the flop and the turn usually have a strong polarized range. Most players. Not all players, but most players. So you'll usually continue when you have decent equity and fold when you do not. Simple as that. The nice thing about floating the flop with all the hands we listed here is that, like I said, you are going to turn some equity some portion of the time, like either a straight draw or flush draw or whatnot, or top pair. So sometimes your draws are going to come in and sometimes they're not. Are we concerned with balance concerns with the range we are floating with? I mean, the thing is you're like, this is just good GTO poker. This is not even like exploitative strategy here where you're floating absurdly wide. I just want to make sure people are not floating too infrequently. Most of the time, people fold too often on every betting round. And the hands that they incorrectly fold are usually some hands that they should be floating with that are kind of junky, like the queen 4 on 6-5-2. You know, it's not great, but it's good enough. Stuff like random overcards on 7-7-2. They have a backdoor flush draw, a backdoor straight draw. Those are good enough. And a lot of people just do not continue. So if anything, most people have a problem with playing too tightly in these spots, not too loosely. Raising the turn bet after you float the flop is usually only ideal if your opponent's turn betting range is either too wide and is full of junk, in which case it will fold very frequently to a raise, or if your opponent's just betting with a polarized range, but they're going to be really, really, really tight when you do raise them. Some people will continue with a polarized range on the turn, as they should, like strong top pairs and better, but then they'll fold out some of the top pairs to a turn raise. So if they fold out all their draws to a turn raise, and they fold out all their top pair marginal kickers, or even top pair good kickers to a turn raise, maybe against those players raising is ideal, but you need your opponent to be especially passive, or you need to have them think that you are especially weak, to the point that you essentially never bluff the turn, right? A lot of players, if you are an older player, you just have a really tight image in general, you can get away with a lot of pretty absurd plays, especially on the turn and river, because most people are going to incorrectly presume that whenever you raise the turn, you just have the nuts. So if they think you have the nuts, then, you know, you should be bluffing a lot. Obviously, call again when you turn additional equity with your junky draws, like we said. That's either going to be a pair, good draw, etc. And fold when you have junk. Fold when you have junk. I cannot make it any more clear. Whenever you float the flop with some weak draw, when the turn is not favorable for you and they keep betting, fold. Don't get insane. A lot of people get it in their heads that because they float the flop, they must now try to run some insane bluff, but it's just not true. Because you have to realize some of your draws are going to improve and some of them are not. Sometimes none of your draws improve. Sometimes just the turn is a awful card for you, like an ace, let's say. If we go back over here to, let's try to find an example. Say it comes 6-5-2, turn is the ace of diamonds, right? Stone brick ace of diamonds for you. We'll still continue with our flush draw and open-ended, But we're going to fold out everything else, right? Besides ace king, of course. Everything else will just have to fold on the ace of diamonds. Some cards are just really, really good for your opponent, and some cards are going to be really, really good for you. Like, say, the turns of 4, or a 3, or an 8, or a 9, right? Those are all going to be pretty great cards for you. So sometimes you're going to win the pot a lot on the turn. Sometimes you're not going to win the pot a lot on the turn. If you go through the tournament masterclass in the turn section, you'll see that some cards on specific boards will heavily favor one player over the other. And whenever you get a bad turn, it's okay. You just fold, right? Like, say, on King 7-4, the turn's an ace. That's a pretty awful turn for you. So you're going to end up folding a lot of the time, right? If the turn's an 8, or a 3, or a 5, or a 4, or a 7, right? These are going to be cards that are pretty great for you. Obviously, you're calling the flop with your 7s and your 4s as well, right? So those cards are going to be really good for you, and that's going to result in you winning the pot a lot. Sometimes you win a lot on the turn, sometimes you do not, and that is A-okay. When you are check 2 on the turn, you should probably exploitatively bet with everything, usually using a large polarized size, assuming your opponent is, we'll call them standard, right? If your opponent's going to bet most of their good hands on the turn and check most of their marginal hands and garbage on the turn, most people are going to fold too often. So, exploitatively bet with everything, using a bigger size, because if you bet small, they're just going to call with all their bluff catchers, and their range is going to be a lot of bluff catchers and garbage, right? Now, obviously, some people are never going to fold a bluff catcher. If your opponent is never going to fold a bluff catcher, then clearly you should not be bluffing all that often. Maybe you shouldn't be floating all that often to begin with. But you're going to find that the vast majority of players, especially in the small and medium stakes games, bet the flop too often, check the turn too often, fold to a turn bet too often, and fold to a river bet too often. So against those players, you should be exploitatively betting very, very frequently and betting big. Because if they have a lot of marginal hands and garbage, you want to apply a lot of pressure. Generally, betting with lots of or betting when a lot of draws arrive that make most decent pairs on the flop much weaker is ideal. So, say the flop comes 9-8-3, 2 spades, and the turn is a jack, right? That's the spot where you have 10-7, you have queen 10, you have the flush draws, right? You just have a lot of those hands. And your opponent, depending on where they raise from, may not, right? So if they don't have very many of those hands, and you have a lot of them, and you know they'll bet all their flushes on the turn, and all their straights on the turn, and all their sets on the turn, and all their 2 pairs on the turn, that makes their range top pair and worse. And while they could have some, whatever the top pair card was, jack, I think I said, while they could have some jacks, if you blast the turn and blast the river, they're going to be pretty unhappy. And they usually don't have even the top pair. They usually have something weaker than that they're going to fold out. Now, if there are 3 spades on the board, your opponent is very likely to check call your turn bet, because they're going to have a lot of hands with an ace or a king of spades, right? But they're going to fold all those out on the river whenever they miss. And when they do hit, sometimes they're also just not going to, like, when they do hit, they're also going to have some misses as well. And like, say they do have ace jack, no spade on a 3-spade turn, and the river is a spade. Now they're always going to fold ace jack to a river bet, or mostly fold ace jack to a river bet, right? And when the river is a spade, or when the river's not a spade, they're going to fold out all the ace and king highs that call the turn bet, right? So sometimes they fold, sometimes they don't. But whenever you're bluffing, you usually only need to win the pot half the time, a third of the time, something like that. And they're going to fold out 40 or 50 or 60% of the time. Usually they're going to fold it out like 50 or 60 or 70% of the time. If you do bet the turn, you very likely want to continue bluffing on the river, again, because people overfold on the river. You especially want to be betting when you unblock hands that they will always fold. They will usually have a hand like decent ace highs, decent draws. So whenever you do not block those hands, whenever you don't have a card with those cards in them, they're more likely to have those cards, right? So if you're sitting there with like the nut low, they're very likely to have stuff like ace high or a middle pair, right? So you want to think, what am I trying to get my opponent to fold? That's what you want to be considering. What do I want to get them to fold? And if you do not have a card in your hand that makes that less likely, it means that they are naturally more likely to have that, right? And in those cases, you should be bluffing like basically every time. I'll tell you though, in general, I personally have made a lot of money doing this, and everybody else I teach has made a lot of money doing this, where you just drastically overbluff when your opponents take passive lines, unless you know your opponent will almost always call the river when they call the turn. Some players, when you bet big on the turn, they are not folding. They're just not doing it. Now, obviously, as there are more draws available on the turn, they're just going to have a lot of busted draws on the river that they will obviously fold. And if you're sitting there with the nut low and they have queen high, it would be criminal to let them see the river for free, right? Or see the showdown for free. So against those players on those rivers, you should still be bluffing. But say the board is kind of uncoordinated and the turn doesn't change much and the river doesn't change much, you have to be way more cautious. Like say they raise early position, you call on the button and it comes 8-7-3, okay? They bet, you float. Turn is a card like a 3, or a 2, 8-7-3-2, right? That's a spot where a lot of players will check call ace high on the turn. And if the river's a blank, they're just always check calling ace high on the river. And they probably don't have a whole lot of draws because they raised from early position. So on that setup, in that scenario, you probably don't want to be bluffing the call happy players on the river because they're going to have a lot of ace highs that just aren't folding, or a lot of hands like pocket fives on 8-7-3 that bet the flop, check call turn, check call river. Other players, though, will just always fold a hand like pocket fives or ace high on the river there because they think when you bet the turn in the river, you just must have the nuts. And they think, all right, I'm going to call the turn bet and then fold if they keep betting. That's what their thought process is. And against those players, obviously, you want to continue betting because they're going to fold out almost everything by the river. So that's floating. I realize there's a lot to it, but hopefully this gives you a good framework for how to approach these scenarios.